Hello everyone and welcome to the Rift. So, you want to learn how to play Yasuo? Well, that's great because I've got just the video for you. Today, I'll be taking you from a Yasuo 0 to a Yasuo hero. We'll be going over key cards in the deck, important rulings to understand when you're playing, some different builds that the deck tends to run, the deck's overall general game plan that it wants to accomplish each game, the deck's strengths and its weaknesses, its overall power level and where I think it lands in the metagame, its matchups. We'll be diving into each one and talking about what Yasuo does well in them and what you should look out for. Then we'll cap things off with an overall ranking of the deck in the game's current metagame with a small discussion on the deck's matchup spread and what I think about the deck overall. But first, if you're enjoying this content, make sure that you like the video, and if you're feeling spicy, make sure that you smash that subscribe button just as hard as you'd smash your favorite League of Legends character. Alright, let's start off with the deck and some key cards in it. Probably the most important cards in this deck are your Yasuo Legend and your Yasuo Champion as well. Your Legend is pretty important for keeping your guys safe in the early to mid game, as well as scoring a bunch of early points in the early game. When you're utilizing Windswept, you can really rack up a surprising number of points pretty quickly in the early game. Although, oftentimes when you're doing that play, you're probably giving up a unit to your opponent, unless you can back it up with stuff like a pump spell, or a counter spell, or gust, or even ganking from Windswept to Reaver's Row if you can get that off. That's pretty good. In the late game, you really want to be attacking with your Yasuo Champion and then pulling him back with your Legend's ability. That's a really strong play. Keeps your Yasuo Champion safe while killing something and taking a point usually, which is very strong. It's probably the strongest play that this deck can make overall, and it's really the heart and soul of how this deck is going to win you games. That being said, it's really important to protect your Yasuo Champion, especially if you're electing not to play any extra copies of it in your main deck, which is a viable option in my opinion. I'll get to that later. It's really important that you protect him with pump spells and counter spells, because if he goes down, that's really bad, because he's most likely going to be your main win condition in most games. So if you can't protect him, it's probably not a great idea to put him on the board until you can, because he'll probably just die, or your opponent will get unlucky and not be able to kill him. You really have to be mindful of the matchup you're playing against, and there are ways of removing Yasuo from the field, because that's very important to track. You have to know when your Yasuo is in danger and when you can safely put him on the board to start pressuring next turn. It really just depends on the matchup, because some decks have a lot of ways of dealing with Yasuo and some decks don't. They'll have maybe one or two, and you need to identify what those are and if you have the answer to that available to you or not. We'll talk about more specifics surrounding that later, but for now, that's a general idea of what you want to do with these two cards. So this deck is basically divided into two halves, I'd say. You have your units and you have your interaction spells. You, more than any other deck in the current format, are going to be running a lot of interaction spells, no matter which build of the deck you're playing, which is sometimes a good thing and sometimes a bad thing, because it really just depends on the matchup that you're up against. Drawing certain interaction spells can be very good in certain matchups, and they could be very bad in other matchups. I'll talk more about that later, but for now, just keep in mind that it's important to keep track of the interaction spells that you have in your deck, the counts of them that have been played this game and that are left, because it's important to know, like, if you need to top deck something, or if you're in a position where the only option that can win you the game is by getting a certain card, you need to understand how many is left in your deck and what the odds are of drawing into that, because that could inform your decision making when you're deciding between potential plays that you can go for. It's important to know what the odds of each play succeeding will be. It's also really important to understand which matchups these cards are good in and which matchups they're not good in, and where you want to use them in each matchup. I'll cover the specifics of each card later when we get to matchups, but just know that it's probably one of the most important things to understand with this deck. You really need to know what you're doing with these cards, otherwise games probably won't go well for you most of the time. This deck is a bit tricky to play because of that compared to the other decks, because you really are the one in the driver's seat in most games. You are the one making decisions. Your opponent is just going to be doing their thing that their deck is designed to do, and it's your job to react to that thing that they're trying to do and stop them. And to be able to do that, you need to understand what their deck is trying to do, how you can stop what they're trying to do, and what cards you need to be able to do that. This deck overall, I'd say, is either a very reactive mid-range deck or just a flat-out control deck if you build it to lean more towards that side of the spectrum. Talking about the deck's units, its units really aren't the star of the show here. There's really not too much to talk about with them, as opposed to a deck like Jinx, where your units are your main focus of your deck. It's just important to know in this deck that if you're playing the mid-range build of the deck especially, you need to understand when you can safely apply pressure in the early game with cheap units, and when it's a risky move to do so. There's also a lot of planning ahead in the late game, especially when you're about to play either Yasuo or Kayn, because most of the time when you do that, that's the only thing you're going to be doing on your turn, unless it's very late game. So you need to kind of understand when you can safely drop one of these cards and what you're going to do with it next turn. There's a lot of planning ahead with this deck in general, thinking about not only what you are trying to accomplish this turn and next turn, but what your opponent is trying to do as well. Going over the cards individually, I think Gust is very good in this deck. It really helps you stabilize in the early to mid game and stave off a ton of pressure from your opponent. It also allows you to sometimes play your units out more aggressively and leave them on battlefields as you pass your turn, because you know you have a Gust in hand and you can potentially protect that unit. Rebuke is really matchup dependent. Sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's really bad. It really just depends. Defy is pretty much always good in every matchup. There's not really a deck that you don't want to have this card against. It's pretty good. Windwall can be a lot more situational. This one especially depends on what matchup you're going up against, because some decks have very impactful high cost spells that you need to counter, and some just don't, and this card is basically useless. Rebuke and Windwall I definitely play at 2 copies in most builds of the deck, unless you're playing the heavy control build. Discipline and On Guard, these cards are great. They're probably the best interactive spells in your deck outside of Last Breath and Defy. They may even be the best. Discipline especially is great, just 2 mana, pump something by 2 unconditionally and draw a card. That's fantastic. On Guard is a little more situational, but it costs less. It also doesn't give you the draw. You have to keep in mind when you're planning ahead on your turns that On Guard can only be used on a unit that's alone, at least if you want to get the bonus, additional might. So you can't just push 2 units at the same time and pump one with On Guard for 2 might. That doesn't work. I think Discipline is a little bit better than On Guard, but I think both have arguments to be included at max copies. No matter what build of the deck you're playing, they're pretty good cards. Last Breath, I think, is definitely a 3 of in the control build, and definitely at least a 2 of, probably a 3 of in the mid-range build. It's just a very good card. You can pump out a ton of damage with Yasuo late game, and as just a mid-game kill something to stabilize spell, it's not bad. I think Teemo is really awkward in this deck. You don't really want to hold onto battlefields that much. You really just want to attack something and then get your unit out of harm's way a lot of the time, but there really aren't many other 2-drop units we can play right now, so I think in the mid-range build at least, you just have to have a few. Merchant and Clock are just nice, cheap 2-drop 2-might units that have additional effects that are relevant sometimes, so until we get better units, you just have to play them. Wielder is a good unit. 3-drop 4-might is pretty strong. I'll talk more later about its weaknesses that you might not think of immediately when you see this card, but other than that, it's pretty strong. Misfortune you could be playing as 1 copy, maybe 2. It's just decent in the late game to suddenly take a field out of nowhere, maybe score your 8th point with, but other than that, combat, it's not great in this deck. Meta Marauder is pretty good. You can either push an enemy unit off of a field to take it easier, or you can push your own guy off to attack with it again, which is really good. It also has take, so it can protect Yasuo and Kayn sometimes. Speaking of Kayn, he's pretty good. He's really good in some matchups and not that great in others. He can sometimes sweep small units off of battlefields or against decks that want to just build a giant tower of guys on one battlefield. He can get in for some chip damage, maybe kill 1 or 2 things each turn while not taking damage himself. If you move him with Yasuo's legend effect and then gank him across to the field with a bunch of guys on it, he'll deal 6 damage, and then since he hasn't cleared the field yet, he'll be sent back to his base. So that's a good play to chip down the opponent bit by bit, turn after turn, if they're trying to build up a big stack on a field. Alright, next let's talk about some important rulings and rules interactions that you need to know when you're playing this deck. Probably the most important is knowing how triggers interact when you attack. We have this ruling confirmed where if you attack and that causes a unit's ability to trigger, you aren't actually in a showdown or in combat yet. That might sound a little weird at first, but I'll explain it with an example. Say you have a wielder of water and a merchant, and you want to attack them both at one battlefield, and the battlefield is being held by some number of enemy units. When you swing both the wielder and the merchant to attack the battlefield, the merchant's effect will trigger. At this point, you are not technically in a showdown yet, nor are you in combat. So what this means is that wielder does not yet get his might boost from his ability. He's still 2 might at this point. It's only until the stack empties and merchant's ability has finished resolving that the wielder will be considered an attacker and gain his extra might. It's the same thing if you swing with Yasuo and wielder, the same thing happens. Why this is important is because cards like Gust exist. If you swing wielder and merchant at the same field, while merchant's effect is on the stack, wielder can be hit by an opponent's Gust and return to your hand because it hasn't gained its might yet. Same thing against opponent's units. If you have a Gust, you can keep in mind that if they attack with something that gains a bonus in combat and something that has an attack trigger, you will be able to Gust the thing that gets its attack boost before it actually gets the boost, which is especially important to know in the mirror match and against Jinx because there are a lot of attack triggers and might boosts in those stacks. Something also important to know while we're talking about attacking is that if you use Yasuo to attack and activate his ability, if at any point before the ability resolves, Yasuo is removed from that battlefield, the ability does nothing because Yasuo says he has to deal damage to a unit here. If Yasuo is no longer here when the ability is resolving, then you can't deal damage to anything. So if you attack with Yasuo and use his effect and he gets rebuked, you can't actually resolve his ability. You don't get to kill anything. Another important ruling to know when playing this deck, it's something pretty minor that probably won't come up that much, but Defy looks at the card's printed cost, the card that you're trying to counter. What printed cost is just the number and the rune count on the top left. Why that's relevant is theoretically there could be an expensive spell that you can play as a hidden later on in the game's life, and it's important to understand that you cannot use Defy against it if it costs too much on its printed value. Even though they only paid 1 power to play it as a hidden, you still can't use Defy on it. Another important thing to know is that if you counterspell someone's spell, like with Defy or Windwall, the spell that they played doesn't actually count as being played, so they don't get to trigger abilities like Legion, or they don't get to count as having played a card this turn if you counterspell their card, so that's important to know as well. It probably won't come up much, but it's still important to understand. I think that that about covers important rulings to know. If I missed any, or I was wrong about any, or any new ones that are important come up, I'll leave them in a pinned comment down in the comments. Alright, let's talk about different builds of the deck that you can play. I've gone ahead and gotten screenshots of mid-range, control, and mono green builds that you can play that I found to be varying levels of viable and not viable. I think a solid argument can be made to play any of these builds. It really just depends on what matchups you want to prepare harder for than others. I won't be talking about the mono green build that much because truthfully, I don't think it's that great. I think the other two builds are better, and I haven't really playtested much with it, so I just won't talk about it that much. The mid-range build is the one I have the most experience with, so I'll be talking about that most. I think this is generally how most people are playing Yasuo right now. I think the mid-range build overall is a little bit better suited for the current meta, especially against your worse matchups and matchups where you're about even. I think the mid-range build comes out on top. In the mid-range build, we're playing a bunch of cheap units so we can score points in the early game with Yasuo's leader effect. This build really utilizes Windswept to its fullest potential, I believe, and Targon's as well. Getting extra mana in the early game's pretty good. I'm also playing Reaver's Row to potentially protect our units in different matchups. I don't really think you want to be playing multiple of the Yasuo champion in this build. It's just a little too costly to play two during the course of a game, and I find that most of the time you just don't really have time to play two of them. You have to be doing other things alongside your one Yasuo if you want to be winning. I'm playing 3 Kayn for that reason, because I think having access to both Kayn and Yasuo is better than having access to 2 Yasuos most of the time, and Kayn is still important enough in enough matchups to where I'd want to play the maximum copies of him, just so I can be able to draw into him when I need him. Drawing 2 can be pretty bricky, yeah, but I think it's worth it. The mid-range build cuts down a little bit on the amount of interactive spells that you're playing compared to the control build, in favor of playing more cheap units that you can play out in the early to mid game that let you score points earlier. It gives you the option of taking over the tempo of the game against certain decks and keeping up with other decks' fast tempo better than the control build in my opinion, but late game it does have a lot less combo potential and a lot less explosive power than the control build does. I think overall the mid-range build has more balanced of a matchup spread. It doesn't struggle as much against certain matchups, but it also doesn't win as easily against others. I think matchups with this deck are mostly pretty close or slightly unfavored just because of the natural brickiness and inconsistency that this deck has. You're basically playing a deck with 2 halves to it. You've got your units and you've got your spells. And if you draw too much of one half and not enough of the other, then the deck can really struggle sometimes. Additionally, if you draw the wrong interactive spells against the matchup you're playing, it can also be a real struggle sometimes. I think this deck really lives or dies overall on its early game draws. Having the right answers and the right units to what your opponent's doing feels like you're in a commanding position most of the time, and when you either don't have enough units or have too many or have the wrong kind of spells, then you struggle a lot. And I think that's the general play pattern with this deck overall. You, more than other decks in the format, I feel, struggle with consistency just because of the limited card pool that we have right now, and especially the lack of a sideboard or a side deck. That particularly really hurts this deck. A lot of matchups I'll find that like half of your interactive spells are either very suboptimal or just don't really do anything, and I think having access to a sideboard would really help this deck a lot. Or just having access to more spells in the format that are versatile and powerful. The control build. This build basically just sacrifices your power in the early game in favor of having a lot more power in the late game. You're running a lot more spells that you can combo with Yasuo. You're also running more copies of Yasuo, and you're running draw spells to try and draw you into card advantage and your combo pieces so you can really pop off hard in the late game. Where this deck struggles is the early game. You're playing a lot less early game units to play down, which means most games you're not scoring very many points in the early game, or you're not scoring any sometimes. Against certain matchups, I think the deck can struggle because of that, but but there are also other matchups where it does very well in, and I'll talk about that more when we get to the actual matchups and specifics about them. The mono green build basically just takes out all of the purple cards because not drawing enough purple runes when you need them can suck. It's basically just the same as the mid-range build, except a little less inconsistent, but also a little less powerful. I think Kayn is pretty important to be playing in certain matchups, and so is Rebuke, so I don't really think the trade-off of extra consistency is worth the power that you're sacrificing in this case. And in this build especially, when you don't open or draw into your seal early game, it can really struggle with trying to keep up with your opponent's energy. Having to put stuff back with Caitlyn or Flock and Yasuo too, as well as your counter spells, it can really add up. So when you get to draw into your seal early game, the deck feels pretty good, and when you don't, the deck can struggle a lot, especially if you draw into multiple copies of cards that need to recycle 2 runes. That can really suck. Alright, let's talk about the overall strengths and weaknesses of this deck. I've already alluded to some of them earlier, but I'll expand upon them a bit. Starting with the deck's strengths. Currently, it's the only deck in the game with access to counter spells, which are pretty good. There are a lot of very strong spells in the format currently, and just getting to say no to them is very good. Having pump spells as well, and a card like Last Breath can sometimes just completely blow people out of the game if they aren't careful. You need to be really mindful of what this deck can do when you're playing against it, so if you aren't careful in considering what this deck can do at any given time, it can be very punishing. I think overall, pump spells are fantastic in this game so far, both offensively and defensively. They may not seem that strong at first, but once you start playing with them a lot, you realize that their power is really exceptional. I think Yasuo, the champion himself, is probably the best card in the deck. It applies a ton of offensive pressure just sitting in base, which is really good. It makes your opponent have to think about what they want to do a lot more, because if they don't think and they just swing and leave things on battlefields, they're probably just gonna lose to this card alone. Sometimes it makes them scared or have to take suboptimal routes because they can't afford to lose units to Yasuo, which is really good for you, obviously, because they're not applying as much pressure now, and this deck can really take advantage of your opponent just not doing enough. If you give this deck a lot of time, it really excels. I think this card being able to punch something that's 12 might just by itself and kill it is very strong. I think this card comboed with pump spells is crazy. You can pump out ridiculous amounts of damage with him, especially in the control build where you have access to a lot more quote-unquote combo pieces, things like pump spells and Last Breath, where you just throw them all on Yasuo in a big combo turn and just punch everything. In the late game, this deck can really output some ridiculous turns sometimes. So if your opponent isn't mindful of what this card can fully do, and they don't understand that they need to play to push you out of the game in the early game, or they don't understand that this card is very important to get rid of, this card can sometimes just run away with the game by itself. But that's if your opponent doesn't understand these things. Against players who do, this card and this deck as a whole, I think, lose a lot of versatility and power. Once your opponent understands how to fully play against this deck and exploit its weaknesses, I think the deck's matchup spread overall goes to about an even level. I don't think it's great in the format. I also don't think it's bad. I think it's a pretty middle-of-the-road deck in terms of power in the current meta anyway, that scales really well with your experience and knowledge as a player when you're playing it, and scales poorly against opponents who are also experienced and understand the game. So overall, at higher levels of play, I feel like this deck is about average in terms of power. It's not great, but it's not bad either. It's just solid. Sometimes you're gonna draw the right cards and win, and sometimes you're not, and you're gonna lose because of it. That kind of feels to be the play pattern with this deck and how games usually go. Having said that, let's talk about the deck's weaknesses. I think its biggest weakness is that it just doesn't have enough options available to it in terms of interactive spells. Certain spells feel very good in certain matchups, and in other matchups, they feel very bad or almost useless. I think once we get more cards in the format, that'll change a lot, and especially if we get a side deck, that'll change a ton too. But for now, it just feels like the deck can brick a lot or just draw spells that aren't very useful in the current matchup. Against certain decks, your early game draws could really make or break the matchup. I think another weakness with the deck is that it just doesn't have that many units and doesn't have that many good units, especially that it can play. It has a lot less than all the other decks in the format, so if you lose a unit, it could feel a lot more punishing in this deck than in other decks. As far as a general game plan with this deck goes, I've already talked about it a bit, but if you're playing the mid-range build, you want to use Yasuo's Legend effect to score a bunch of points, use your spells to stop your opponent from doing the same, and then stabilize in the mid to late game with the Yasuo champion, and then use him to control the pace of the game from there. That's the ideal playstyle and play pattern with this deck. It of course doesn't always pan out that way. Sometimes you just don't draw enough spells to stop your opponent from doing what they want to do and they take over the game. Sometimes you draw too many spells that aren't very helpful and the same thing happens. Sometimes you don't draw enough units or a unit dies and you just can't take enough points. But on the flip side, sometimes you do draw the right spells and then you stop your opponent from being able to really take over the early game and you just push them out for the rest of the game. Or you draw counter spells that stop them and the same thing happens. Or sometimes they just don't draw well enough in the early game and Yasuo's champion can just clean up the game. With the control build, you sacrifice your early game to have a much bigger combo pop off in the late game, so you probably won't be doing much in the early game. You'll just be trying to stop your opponent from scoring points, and that's pretty much it. Sometimes you can be a little aggressive in the early game, but it's less consistent to do that with the control build. Where the deck really starts to get going in the control build is when you play Yasuo and then you start popping off with him. You can put out some ridiculous amounts of damage during a turn with this build, so sometimes that's enough to just clean up the game from there. Other times it's not. Something you can do with this build is play 2 Yasuos and start popping off with them, which is pretty fun. Sometimes you can have 2 huge pop-off turns, which is also a lot of fun. I think this deck can fulfill its general game plan a little more consistently than the mid-range one can, because you're playing so late game focused, you have time to draw into all of your combo pieces, whereas the mid-range build doesn't have that much time. But I think sacrificing the early game in most games is just a really big downside of it. But the deck's overall power level, I think it's, again, pretty middle of the road. I said it before, but I think some games it can do really well if you draw well, and other games you just won't because you didn't draw as well. I think overall right now the deck is in a fine spot. It's not too strong, it's not too weak, it's just fine. It's really hurt mostly by its inconsistency and its lack of a sideboard or more playable cards in the format. Alright, let's start talking about some matchup specific stuff. I'll start off with Volibear first. I think this is a pretty good matchup overall for you. I'd say it's either slightly winning or even. It depends on the build of deck that you're playing and the build that they're playing, but most of the time I think it's either a winning or an even matchup for you. If you're playing against the ramp version of Volibear, where they're just gonna tower a bunch of big dudes onto one battlefield and hope you can't break through, I think both the mid-range and the control builds of Yasuo have their upsides and downsides, but overall I think they're both about even matchup-wise. The mid-range build is a little better for taking some points earlier so you can be ahead of them in tempo, and the control build is a little bit better at being more explosive and outputting a ton more damage in the late game. So it's easier to break down their giant tower of guys in the late game with that build. What you want to do basically against against the ramp volley build is just take a few points in the early game so that you're ahead of them in terms of points, and then they'll basically be forced to try and pile a bunch of guys onto one battlefield to build up a wall of dudes that you hopefully can't break through. So you just want to put out Yasuo, put out Kayn, maybe get in some chip shots with Kayn, kill a few things over a few turns, and then eventually you just pile a bunch of pump spells and last breaths onto Yasuo and swing for a ton of damage, and hopefully you can break down their big fountain of guys. Against the more aggro, low-end version of Volibear, where they play a bunch of red aggro cards, I think the mid-range build of Yasuo is definitely more suited to be able to handle what this matchup is trying to do. They have a hard time of pulling their guys back to safety, so oftentimes you're just going to be able to either trade or get positive trades on them when you're swinging, and with Yasuo's effect you can keep your guys safe while most of the time they can't. So as long as you're about even points-wise with them and trading efficiently, once you put Yasuo down onto the board, I think the matchup becomes favorable for you, at least a little bit favorable. They really have a hard time dealing with Yasuo outside of specifically drawing either challenge or snapvine to try and kill him, and you have a lot of answers in your deck for both of those cards. You have more counter spells than they have challenges, and you have more pump spells than they have snapvines. So in theory you should be winning interactions against this deck most of the time. As long as you're making sure that you protect Yasuo and you're not leaving him on a battlefield, I think you should be in a winning position against this matchup. They really have a hard time at dealing with Yasuo outside of their specific answers. I think using Gust and Rebuke on some of their stuff to try and deny them a few points is decent as well, and obviously counterspelling their spells is excellent. Some things to watch out for against this deck: obviously Deadbloom, you don't want to leave stuff on board that you don't want to get killed, and Misfortune as well. It can be difficult to play against this card because it allows them to pull their other stuff back into safety, and especially when they have two Misfortunes, that can be a bit dicey. Last Breath can bail you out of situations like this. If they just swing with Misfortune, you can Last Breath it and prevent them from pulling a lot of their dudes back to safety in the future. For battlefields that you want, Windswept and Targons are pretty good. You don't really want to give them Reavers because they'll be able to pull their guys back into safety a lot more, which is bad for you because you want to be trading against their guys and killing their guys with Yasuo. So overall, I think this matchup is pretty straightforward and a decent matchup for you. Alright, let's talk about Viktor next. I think this matchup is overall pretty even. You have a lot of good answers for what they're trying to do in form of counter spells. Defy is excellent in this matchup, as well as Windwall to stop stuff like Grand Stratagem. And even if you have to use Windwall against a cheaper spell that they're trying to play, it's not that bad because you're still stopping what they want to try to do. Your removal spells like Gust and Rebuke aren't that good in this matchup. Gust can hit cheaper stuff, but a lot of their cheaper stuff gets them tokens when they play it, so you really don't want to be gusting those things, but sometimes you just have to. And rebuking some of their more expensive units is pretty good as well. It puts them behind in tempo. The game plan for this matchup is also pretty simple. I think you just contend with them in the early game, trade units, and then put Yasuo down and protect him. They take a little bit to get their deck really going and really online, so they're gonna hand over a few points to you in the early game because they're a bit slower to get going. With Windswept, you can definitely take the tempo of the game into your hands most of the time using Yasuo's legend ability. In the mid game, it's really important to have Yasuo down or Kayn to be sweeping stuff. They're also playing a deck that has a hard time protecting their stuff, except with cards like Siphon Power, which you have answers for. Once they put things on battlefields, they've kind of committed it there. They can't really pull it back in any way, and their only source of protecting it is their spells, which you have counter spells for. So Yasuo can do a lot of work in this matchup, same as Kayn. The only thing that you're really going to be struggling with in this matchup is if you don't draw enough counter spells for their removal, or if they just draw more removal than you have answers for. If they manage to kill Yasuo, the game is probably going to be very difficult for you to win from that point, so you really want to make sure you can protect him or at least get some value out of him when you play him. I would honestly hard mulligan and try to just dig into your counter spells as much as you can, especially Defy. That's probably the best card in the matchup. I think if you can stick Yasuo on board through the mid and late game, it becomes very difficult for your opponent to deal with him. Outside of specifically Harness Dragon, of course, which you don't have an answer for. But if you're at a point in the game where you've been ahead in points, you can kind of choke them out in terms of tempo if they do decide to put down a Harness Dragon, because when they do, that's usually their entire turn to do that because it costs so much mana. So they could potentially be going behind too much in tempo and just not be able to recover in terms of actually winning the game points wise, as long as your game plan has been working in the early to mid game at least. I would try your best to always save a wind wall in your hand for Grand Stratagem. If you have to use it to stop something crucial, then it is what it is, but I really think you need to stop Grand Stratagem when you see it, or else things are going to get dicey, especially if they're on 6 points and they can play it. Sometimes that could just be game over right there unless you have wind wall. Overall, I think this matchup is pretty even on paper at least. In practice, it just comes down to how many answers you draw and how many they draw, I think. So this matchup could be slightly unfavored for you because they mathematically have more removal and spell options than you have counter spells to deal with. So overall, this matchup should either be even or slightly unfavored for you. I think in terms of battlefields, Windswept and Targons are pretty good. Reaver's Row you don't really want to give them, and everything else that Yasuo would normally play is pretty even into the matchup. So prioritize Windswept and Targons. Alright, let's talk about Jinx next. Jinx can be a difficult matchup for you. Their aggressive pushing power is just a lot for you to deal with, especially in the early game. Their deck comes out swinging very fast and very hard, and they don't stop because they get to keep drawing extra cards with Jinx's Legend effect. So even if you're trading evenly or even trading positive, sometimes this deck can just overrun you with pure card advantage. I think Defy is excellent against this deck. It can stop all their cheap removal spells, and it can stop Rocket especially, which is probably the best spell they have. Windwall is okay. It's probably too expensive to really get any value in this matchup, but if you don't have enough Defies to stop what they're doing, then Windwall can help you sometimes. I think Gust is really good in this matchup. Just putting guys back into their hand is excellent, because if you put them back in their hand, that means sometimes they won't have the requirement to draw extra cards with Jinx's Legend effect next turn, which is really good for you because it stops them from drawing extra cards. Rebuke is decent. It can put back stuff that's more expensive, especially Purple Jinx. Rebuking that is really good. It stops a lot of their momentum when you do it, so if you can save Rebuke in your hand, waiting for that card to come down, it's probably best to do so. But obviously, if you have to play it, then it is what it is. I think this matchup is pretty difficult for you. You want to stop their early game aggression as much as you can, but it really just depends on how well you draw. Some of your hands are just too slow or just too expensive to really do much against them. You really want to get a bunch of cheap stuff that you can play. Cheap units, especially Wielder, are really good. Gust is also very good. Pump spells are good as well. I think you want to try as much as possible to trade positively into this deck. Trading 1-for-1 doesn't really feel great when they get to draw a bunch of cards extra, especially if you're trading 1-for-1 on units. Your deck doesn't have many units, and theirs has a lot of units. So sometimes if you're trading, you can just run out of guys to put on the board, and the game's pretty much over. Without Reavers, they have trouble protecting their guys, but it sometimes doesn't matter because they just get more cards anyway. Yasuo and Kayn can be pretty good in this matchup if you manage to get them down in time. So sometimes if you're able to stop their aggressive pushes in the early game and slow them down enough, you are able to stabilize against them and sweep up the game with Yasuo and Kayn. In the early game, you basically just want to stop them from scoring as much as possible and try not to lose your units. It's easier said than done, but if you can do this, then you're in a good spot. In the mid game, this is probably the make or break point of the matchup most of the time. You either slow them down enough and you're able to stabilize, or you're not and you just get pushed out out of the game from there. In the late game, you'll probably just know whether you've won or lost already by the state of the board. Sometimes they can get some good top decks and just combo out of nowhere, but that's pretty rare. There's not really much to say about the late game. I think it just plays itself out most of the time. If you've been winning throughout the game, there's not really much they can do, and if you've been losing, there's not really much you can do. So overall, I think this matchup is tough for you most of the time. I'd say it's slightly a bad matchup for you, maybe more than slightly, depending on the build of the deck. I think you have better chances against the build that wants to combo with purple Jinx than you do against the really aggressive build that uses red Jinx. And against red Jinx, it really just depends on you being able to slow them down enough in the early to mid game. For battlefields, you like Targons a lot. Windswept is okay, but it can also let them score extra points, so it's mid, I'd say. Reaver's Row really sucks against them. You don't want them to be able to save their units basically ever. And other than that, I think most of the other battlefields are pretty even. The ones that you would play in this deck, at least. You obviously shouldn't play stuff like Zon Warrens against them. Alright, the mirror match. This really just comes down to scoring points in the early game, trading positively, and protecting Yasuo. Obviously, battlefields don't matter, because you're both playing the same deck, so just pick anything, it really doesn't matter. Maybe you can make an argument that Windswept is slightly better in the mid-range build, because you have more units to utilize early game, and Targon's is slightly better in the control build, because you have more spells to utilize with it. But overall, I don't think it really matters that much. It's just a minor buff sometimes. Counter spells are really good in this matchup to use both on their spells and their counter spells as well. I think what you spend your counter spells on during a game really just depends on how the game is going. If you're in a winning position, sometimes you can afford to hold counter spells in your hand to potentially get better value from them later and use them in more crucial moments. But if you're losing, sometimes you don't have that option and you just have to use them. Defy is best used against another copy of Defy in a counterspell war. Usually you don't want to use it on Gust, but if you have to, then you can. Wind Wall is good against pretty much anything. It's great against Last Breath, and it's great against another Wind Wall as well. I think the counter spells as well as Last Breath are probably the best cards in this matchup. Rebuke is okay on Yasuo too, because it stops the damage effect, as I said earlier. Defy is good against other copies of Defy, as well as against their pump spells. I prioritize using it against Discipline, because that draws a card, instead of using it against On Guard. So usually what you want to do in the matchup is, if it's your big combo turn and you have one of each or multiple copies of those cards in your hand, you want to play your On Guard first to bait out their Defy, so that when you play your Discipline, it's not countered and you get the draw from it. Basically, the game plan, like with most mirror matches, I think, is to just lay out your normal game plan, make smart trades, look for your opponent's mistakes and punish them when you can. Getting Yasuo down early and protecting him is really good, but they're still going to be able to pull away their Yasuo anyway, so you can't really hit your Yasuo into their Yasuo most of the time, unless they just have to leave it on board. So I'd really prioritize taking a bunch of points, as many as you can safely in the early game, because once it comes down to both players attacking and running away with Yasuo every turn, you're not going to be scoring as many points as you did before each turn, unless you want to throw away units into Yasuo's effect, of course, which is a valid play to get points up ahead on your opponent. I think most of the time it just comes down to a points race and who has the better answers and who has the better spells during the big combo pop-off turns. And obviously, I think matchup-wise, this is an even matchup because it's a mirror match. You're playing the same decks. The mid-range build is better at taking points in the early game, but the control build is better at dishing out explosive power and killing stuff with Last Breath better in the late game, so I think it could go either way. So again, I'd say it's about even if you're playing different builds of the deck against each other. Okay, that was a lot of talking. I guess the only thing left to do is give my final ranking and thoughts on the deck. I'd stick this deck about in B tier, maybe low B tier, maybe high B tier. It really just depends on how good the other decks are going to be. This deck has some good matchups and it has some bad matchups. It's pretty even in terms of matchup spread across across the board. Volibear is a little easier to deal with, and Jinx can give you some trouble, but overall it's pretty fair. I'd say the mid-range build wins out in terms of matchup spread a little bit. Just having the option of taking points in the early game is pretty good against a lot of different matchups. I find that you don't really need a huge explosive combo turn most of the time. You just want to take some points early game, trade some stuff, then stabilize with Yasuo and keep him alive, and that should do the trick most of the time. Overall, this deck is pretty fun to play. I like having the big pop-off turns and going crazy with Yasuo sometimes. This deck does require a lot of thought from you though, so if you're not a player who likes to think a lot during games, then this deck probably isn't for you. But if you love trying to solve puzzles during games and math out stuff in your head and try and mind game or bluff your opponent, this deck is going to really click with you, and I think you'll get a lot of enjoyment out of playing it. Alright, I think that's enough rambling for one day. Thank you guys for watching all the way and sticking with my content. I'll be doing a lot more interesting stuff in the future, so make sure you subscribe to stay up to date with the channel. And yeah, that's about all I want to say. Take care.